On the 8th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me. The Milking Maids, or Of Boys and Beasts, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Once upon a time, in a land far away and forgotten by all who still draw breath, there was a town without neighbour or friend, and whose residents had long forgotten how they came to be there. But they were happy to be there, for they had their own customs and ways, their own times and celebrations, and their own trials and dangers which kept them locked in the borders of their little town. Mostly. Now, travelling north on Hammer Street from the Upper West Quarter, there was a band of boys whose families were neither great nor small, but worked and earned as many others did in those days. There were 5 in all, 2 of 13, 1 of 12, 1 of 10, and another of 8. All were dressed in simple cotton shirts of cream, blue, and brown, half tucked, some loose, and the rest dangling to the middle thigh, with all in short pants and barefoot. And, after the custom for boys, all wore their hair long, and tied at the nape with twine to keep their hairs from sticking to their dewy skin, though it was no later than 10 in the morning. But that was the very reason they'd been able to make their way up the Hammer. Their fathers were long gone for work, and their mothers had turned them out to busy themselves about their own business. Thus the band of boys were able to rush through Boots Heel to the western gate that opened onto the Hammer, and make good on the plan they'd anticipated for weeks now. For, you see, the youngest among them was soon to be a boy of 9, and those of their party had taken up a ritual, as many boys had, to go into the North Woods before their 9th name day and become men. Thus it was today, beneath the early summer sun, that the boy of 8 was pushed to the front of the band and forced to walk the Hammer. His name was Geoffrey Mullard, but everyone called him Joff. "Why do we do this?" Joff asked for the 10th time with a roll of eye, grinning. "None of you have found woods folk. What be chance of our happening upon them for my account?" "We're like to be doomed never to find them," Rick said, the eldest of the boys, and a tall youth of red hair and black eyes that made him look more demon than boy with his snowy skin. He wrapped his arm round Joff and pulled him to his side by his neck with a laugh. "But we'll get to snare a rabbit or 2 and climb some trees besides." Joff nodded and kept pace with Rick. "That'll be good fun, I suppose." "There's a river in that, isn't there?" Lonnie asked through crooked teeth. He was the boy of 10, and short as Joff but rail thin, better known for being a maid's son from the south of his accent. Rick rolled his eyes. "No, lummox, that's the southeast." "Not but trees in the north," Jackson said. He was the boy of 12, and the strongest of them, thanks to his helping his father in the forges. He had a look like Joff otherwise, tan, blue eyes, and dark hair. Jackson wrapped his arm round Lonnie's shoulder like Rick did to Joff and continued aloud. "You'll find the lay of it eventually, Lon. Think, with summer finally here, we'll be out most of the day and night." "We'll go to that river in the south tomorrow," Rick piped up, looking past Joff to the other pair with a smile. "How's that sound?" Lonnie smiled with a nod, cheeks red. "Fine enough, Rick." The other just listened as they went. Jackson's elder brother of 13, though you'd not know it from his small stature and shy face. He didn't talk often, even when excited, but he did pull on his brother's shirt or sleeves to point out something or speak low to him. A few times it was him alone that saved them all from walking face first into the back end of a cart or the hooves of an ass. The first of which they almost did twice as they wove through the light traffic, horse, cart, and foot alike, as people busied about this or that. But there were no accidents to keep them from the northern pastures as they wound off the Hammer for the rolling hills of cattle country, speckled with the odd old oak. "Mind for snakes," Jackson said. "The little one should have hatched by now." "Only until the woods," Rick said as they climbed the first of what would be many fences to cut through an unknowing farmer's field. "No serpents in the north." "True," Jackson said, blue eyes never off the ground after Dan, his elder, leapt down. "But still, I hear grounds near Cunning Hill are becoming rifer with the like than ever." "Good thing we're not close to 'em, isn't it?" Lonnie called, as Joff walked beside Jackson and Dan a little behind the others. They went for nigh an hour, mayhap 2, passing empty fields and ones full of red or black cattle, another with sheep. They leapt more than 7 fences and crossed 9 open gates besides. By then, Joff's arms swung heavy as he panted as they climbed up another hill, this one cursedly bare of shade trees. He was thirsty, sweat making his shirts cling to him and itch as he pulled them out of his short pants and moved the fabric around to cool himself atop the hill. "Rick?" Joff asked. The elder turned, brushing sweat off his reddening forehead too. "Have you a water skin in that pack?" "You didn't bring any?" Rick asked, pulling the simple cloth pack from his shoulder and fetching out the skin. Joff shook his head with a flush and thanked him for the drink, passing it back as he turned to find Dan pulling on Jackson's tucked shirt. Jackson looked at him eye to eye. "What? Now I'll not carry you." Rick and Lonnie set back down the hill, chattering amongst themselves. Something about girls or their hair, but Joff stopped and waited as the brothers tarried atop the hill. Dan spoke low enough that he couldn't hear him, but Jackson answered normally. "I'll not carry you, because I'm tired too." Then Dan whispered something. Jackson hissed and rolled his eyes before kneeling with his back to his brother. "Fine, but I can't carry you in the woods or we both should fall, understand?" "Yes," Dan said with a smiling nod as he climbed onto his brother's back and they both caught up to Joff. "You baby him, Jackson," Rick called up ahead near the base of another tall, grassy hill, while he and Lonnie waited for the rest. "If he doesn't walk, he'll become cripple." "Then I'll leave him for the wolves," Jackson called with a smile, muscles bulging. Dan chuckled and smacked his brother's head. "You will not. Papa would make you into a hat." "No." Jackson smirked up at his brother as they joined the others at the base of the hill. "Then he'd have no sons and have to start all over again." Rick huffed a laugh, running fingers through dark, coppery hair. "I'm sure he mightn't mind." Jackson laughed and shoved his shoulder. "Still your tongue." They all laughed as they climbed the hill, even Joff, though he didn't understand why. Then on they went, from field to field, stopping twice under some trees to rest from the heat of midday and eat a little cheese and bread. Rick had been kind enough to not only share with Joff, but pull out an apple for each of them. There was a small party then, all slobbering the fat apples with juice running down their chin and new energy enough for a little play. They wrestled some in the shade and climbed low in the trees before they wandered their eyes onto the red, horned cattle that trickled into that field from another. That's when the trouble started. Lonnie, ever the trickster, had come to name the cattle and give them voices and stories that made the boys laugh. Joff thought, were he in the Lord's houses, he could be a jester, as in the stories. But that would not be the end of it. Spurred on by the others, Lonnie put on a play with himself and Jackson, both acting as bulls fighting over a cow's love, like she were a princess. "Why all the girls?" Joff thought, but laughed with Rick and Dan all the same so they wouldn't think him a child. Then Lonnie turned and pointed to a bull red as Rick and called after him. It took no notice of him, but Lonnie didn't stop. He marched up to the bull with all the sense of letting the blind discern gold from silver, set his hands on his head like he had horns, and stamped angrily. The bull still didn't notice him beyond a snort and shake of his great horned head. Then he went back to grazing. The boys called for him to stop, that the joke was done and they should leave, but Lonnie was too lost in his game, and spurned the bull again and again until the boys all came down the hill with Rick at their lead, telling Lonnie the joke wasn't funny anymore, and they were leaving. With their backs to him, Lonnie snorted, then squealed. Everyone turned like their father had shouted fire, and found Lonnie bolting like a stag with the bull reared behind him and giving chase. Rick screamed for them all to run, scooped up Joff to his stomach, and took up his own gallop with a flurry of curses as everyone joined in. They ran, screaming and half mad, for several minutes, Lonnie nearly being speared through more than once, until Rick shouted that they follow him to a fence on the horizon. Joff saw none of it, only the snorting bull over Rick's shoulder. He didn't see the wooden fence, was only thrown over it with a thud before Rick leapt over it with Dan, lithe, fast Dan. Then Jackson and Lonnie jumped over as well. They didn't stop, though. Jackson grabbed Joff and half-drug him in a run, eyes wide, faces frantic, hearts beating out of Joff's chest, until the fence and bull were smudges in the distance from the shade of a large outcropping of trees. Rick collapsed to his knees, panting, almost vomiting. Lonnie leaned on a tree, bent over and wheezing. Jackson leaned on his knees as his brother panted silently, hand on his back and standing straight as if the run hadn't happened at all, the only evidence being his sweaty red face. And Joff fell back into the grass, eyes shut as he gulped for air. "You really are an idiot sometimes," Jackson said to Lonnie, drawing Joff's eye. Lonnie turned and went red, shaking his head with a slack mouth, panting his words. "I'm sorry. I didn't think... I didn't think it would charge, me, us." "What did you think would happen?" Jackson came back, pushing past his brother. "Stop," Rick said, standing straight and forcing himself to steady his breath. As Joff looked up, Rick could have been a guard with how stern his face had turned. "It's over and done. Learn to use your head for more than a hammer, Lon. I'd see you a man before you're dead, thank you." Lonnie just nodded, shoulders slouched and eyes down as he whispered an ashamed apology. Jackson flicked to Rick defiantly and their eyes clashed. Then his face puckered before he blinked with a curse and turned away, scuffing his heel in the turf. "Are we close to the bloody woods yet?" Jackson asked, with his back to the other boys. Then Dan, breathing heavy through his nose, tapped his brother's back. He pointed north as Jackson faced him, and they all followed his finger. Not 3 minutes' walk from them, the pasture ended in a high brick wall, capped in glistening white stone that ran east and west, far as Joff could see. And beyond, the ancient twisted trees of Northwood grew high in the sky, some higher than the manors of their lords and ladies even. Joff stood, mouth half open, as he furrowed his brows and looked up to Rick. "How are we meant to climb that? I thought the Northwood was open as in the east." Rick shook his head. "Not here. It's walled off so the farmers don't go any deeper into the woods." "They've not the Allens in the woods?" Lonnie asked from the other side of the trees, just coming into view with hands on his hips. Jackson snorted. "What's left of them, sure." "If they ever see a woodsman, they'll never tell." Rick spat and pulled the pack off his shoulders, descending the hill as he kept talking. "Our beloved lords and ladies are mute as corpses when it concerns the North. Besides," he chuckled and shrugged his shoulders, "I'd rather find me a woods woman." He looked over his shoulder to Joff and winked. He laughed and nodded his head to hide that he still didn't understand why Rick always talked about girls so much. But Lonnie laughed and piped in. "If you find a woods woman, point me to his sister." "You can have the ugly one," Jackson joked as they came upon the wall and stopped. "Fart chance," Rick snickered. "Who's to say I won't marry them both?" Lonnie barked a laugh, hands on his hips. "Like you could please 2 women?" Rick faced him, smirking, the rope he'd pulled out of his pack held in one hand. "How might you know? Who's to say I haven't already?" Jackson snorted and shoved his shoulder lightly. "Enough. Just get on with it before dark, will you?" Rick smiled wide at them both and shook his head before he unbound the rope and tied it to a dull hook before he shouldered his pack again. "There's just enough ledge on that stone for this to catch. I'll go up first, then let down a rope. Here." He pulled the stake and hammer from the outside pocket of his pack and handed them to Joff. "It's your name day, so you get the honors." Well, thanks, friend. Joff joked, but Rick continued, casting up the hook. It missed and thudded to the grass. He cursed and tried again, missing. Then I'll have you secure it. I'll do the same on the other side, so no one has to weigh it down. He heaved, almost shouting, and the hook crested over the top, clattering on the stone and falling over the back edge. Rick shouted a joyful curse and took the rope before it flew away, tugging it taut and yanking it several times. Then he climbed the wall with the other boys' cheers pushing him on, especially as he pushed himself up to stand and face them. He put his hands on his hips, wind-tossing straight red locks, and smiled, waving a palm over them all. "My thanks, small folk. Now be still, that you might hear your king's voice." He chuckled at himself and set the hook aside before pulling off his pack to dig out a long rope with huge knots every 2 feet or so. He threw a length of it down and called for Joff to get to work, so the youngest took to it, Rick trying the rope until it pulled without give. "Perfect, Joff. Now throw the hammer up to me." Rick called as he tossed the rest of the rope down to the other side. "I can't throw that far," Joff said, then handed it to Jackson. "You're the strongest. Will you do it?" "Sure, little man." He smiled wide and took the hammer, calling up to Rick before he sent it right into the elder's hands. Then Rick was down the rope like a squirrel, and after a few moments he called for them to test it. Lonnie took it and pulled, and after a few trials the rope was secure enough for them to climb with Joff in the lead. It was his name day, after all. As they landed, Joff stood nearby to Rick, facing the ancient northwood. Giant trees grew up with massive trunks, straight like they'd sprouted in an hour to fight for daylight. Their bark was as pitch, some almost black, with a few pale ashes bleeding through as twisted, mangled branches fought for space amongst the canopy. Sunlight filtered through as the hot easterly wind rocked their upper branches, unable to pierce them, leaving the ground stagnant and cool in the perpetual shade. Joff stepped forward, head tilting slightly and eyes unblinking as hairs stood up on his nape and chills ran down his spine. There was something on the air, something more than shadow, earth, or musk. There was age. It fluttered on the air like moths, the age not just of long life but of rot and decay, like disintegrating wood and wet leaves, like old bones and wet rocks that saw their rivers carve the land into a canyon. There were eyes in the air too, invisible eyes from every curve of every tree. The forest watched them, and it did not blink. Joff started with a shriek as a hand took his shoulder. Rick smiled down on him and patted his back. "Don't look into it too long. Some think you can go mad." "That's just stories," Jackson said. "As are the wood folk," Joff said low, turning his eyes back into the shadow of the forest. No one answered him, though he was sure they all heard. No one made a sound as they stared between the trees. They just breathed and watched, waiting for something. But what? Rick clapped his hands and everyone found him between wood and band, legs spread wide and hands still together as he turned to each of them. "We're looking for woods folk, gentlemen, and that means we have a ways to go, and look for tracks, marks, and signs of camp or travel. It'll be tricky, but we can manage. I know you remember from your own times hunting, but our Joff's never been, so let's make the short of it. Jackson, you first." Jackson stayed where he was beside his brother. "They walk like men, but their feet are cloven hooves. Their tracks will look like deer, but if you can count, you can tell the difference between 2 feet and 4. And their prints are larger too," Rick added before pointing to Dan. "They only camp when they hunt and not this close to people," Dan said low in a shy voice, face turning redder the longer he spoke. "They're smart and old. They don't like trespassers. They'll kill you." "But only if you're rude or attack them," Rick added quickly, pointing to Lonnie. "No jokes, we're losing light." Lonnie sighed. Only woodsmen come out to hunt. Woodswomen stay in their villages, but they're as fierce as the men in their own way. If we find them, be careful. And never approach them, especially if they outnumber you. But if they find you, just be respectful and humbly ask to be shown the way out, Rick added, then smiled and pulled a necklace from under his shirt. And lastly, if you can manage it, present them a gift, and the old ways demand the woodsfolk return you gift for gift. I'm the only one who's got one, but maybe we'll all get lucky this time.
Wait, you've actually met the woodsfolk?
Joff asked, stepping forward with mouth open and a stupid grin. Rick smiled wide like he were 10 years their elder and telling them of some triumphant battle that he'd led. I gave a gift, and he gave me one. He shook the necklace and regarded it briefly. A simple leather cord with brown and red beads strung between 5 pieces of ivory. Then he put it back against his skin and motioned them on. Come, gents, let's find the woodsfolk and make Joff a man. With that, they were off into the shadow of Northwood. They wove between the giant trees, some half around as the houses and Boots' heel, scenting the air, running hand on leaf when they passed the odd bush, eyes scanning the lichen and grassy ground. They walked for hours, never straying far from one another and calling in short hoots like Rick had taught them, waiting for all the rest to answer before moving on. Their water was low, their food nearly gone, and the sun setting, though not so low that it threatened with darkness just yet. On his own, Joff crouched on a bare patch of turf, the ground black and the earth turned up with dozens of tracks. He set his hand over the blackened heap. Cold. The fire was long dead, no telling how far back, but the tracks varied in age, all cloven-hooved and 2-footed. He looked around and shut his eyes, breathing through his nostrils until his chest ached. He took in the musk of the forest, the rotten leaves, the moss and wet rock where there were none, the decay, for lack of it. Then there was something else, something warm, something familiar. He opened his eyes and let out a cry, a long, high note the others repeated. Then he chattered a yip to call them all to him, and in less than a minute the others came from around the trees, Dan and Rick silent as death, but Jackson hissing at noisome Lonnie. "Be quiet," Rick lashed. Then Lonnie went straight as an arrow and red as a berry. Jackson smiled with thanks and motioned Rick on. "What have you, Joff?" Rick asked in a low voice, motioning all the boys to do the same.
A camp. It's old, I think, but there are fresh tracks in the old too.
He pointed to the fire, then the tracks. Rick knelt on one knee and surveyed the area, even looking up and around, ears prickling like a fox. "These trees we used to hang rope. Look there. You see the wounds in the wood?" And everyone looked at the 2 giant trees encasing the camp. And there were tents. There, and there. He pointed to each dull patch in the undergrowth and the odd churn of soil around it, smoothed over from summer rains. He patted off Joff's back with a wide smile and stood, turning to face the others and taking his shoulders from behind. Here, his first time, and he's found a camp even I didn't know of. He bent at an angle and smiled down on Joff like what the youngest imagined a big brother would do, his now loose hair tumbling around his face. Joff smiled, then shoved it down, stepping away to face him with folded arms.
"But it's old. They're nowhere close, surely."
"It's 2 weeks," Dan said, turning every head with shocked eyes. "Men and woods folk don't share much. The season's turn is one, but the celebration of the pact is another." "That was 2 weeks ago, wasn't it?" Jackson said low, eyes distant. "They hunt to celebrate, the men, anyway," Dan continued. "And they don't roam far from home when they do. Not for a celebration like Pax Day, anyway." Rick smiled like he'd walked home to find a supper of sweet cakes, then clapped Joff's back a little too loudly before he pulled out his knife and marked a trunk. "Come on, boys. This way. We could well find their home. Think of that. No one will believe us." He huffed a laugh and pressed forward, Joff close behind as the others fell in line, Dan and Jackson at the rear. They walked north, always north, for another 20 minutes, Rick marking their way until the excitement drained from them and their pace slowed. But just as Joff was about to complain, Rick went bone stiff and threw up a hand. Everyone froze and slowly peeked around him, creeping to his shoulders and staring. A few paces before them, the trees ended, and a great expanse of open field and yard stretched well into the distance, near the horizon, with queer-shaped houses of wood and brick mixed. The grass seemed to glimmer with dew despite the hour. The northerly wind was cool and sweet between the boughs, blowing chimney smoke and the smell of supper the like the boys had never smelt. Dirt trails connected the disparate homes, all branching off a larger road with barns sprinkled here and there, and red and white cattle grazing in their lots, though there was no sign of a crop anywhere, nor a resident, though smoking chimneys meant there had to be. Then Jackson pointed, and everyone followed. A little ways east there was a heifer stood before a queer barn, chewing her cud with a leash round her nape and head that was tied to a pole in the ground. Before it was a stool, and sat there was a girl with her back to them. She looked tall for a girl, and even though her working clothes weren't well fitted, they showed enough of her figure. Her hair was under a bonnet, with red strands flying here and there. Her shoulders, somewhat broad under the puffy upper sleeves of her shirt, rolled as she worked the cow's udder, bending just slightly so they could see the smooth skin of her nape. Even Joff stared and licked his lips, mouth suddenly dry, making his way to the tree line, to poke his head out and watch her work. Then Rick's hand found his shoulder and Joff jumped with a hissing apology. Rick smirked and winked, but there was something in his face Joff hadn't seen before, as he gestured with his head and led them until they were only 10 paces from the girl, and still staring at her back. Rick stooped and pointed, whispering in Joff's ear, "She's pretty, isn't she?" Joff nodded. "Why don't you go say hello, and see if you can trade something with her?" Joff went stiff as a board, his eyes wide with the cold tremble worming up his back and paralyzing his legs as he gulped. He shook his head. He had no gift. Then Rick pulled out a small wooden figure carved after the last king of the settlers before the Cunninghams took control of the houses. "Give her this." "Go on." He nudged Joff lightly until he was at the tree line, but Rick was no further away, black eyes glued to the girl. "We'll be with you, brother, but you must go while there's only the one of them. Haste." "Don't mention the animal parts," Dan said quickly. "They think it rude." Joff swallowed and nodded, taking the figure and drawing as much courage as he could muster. It was enough to step beyond the trees, but once he touched the supple grass, all that young fire drained out of his feet and left his legs like pudding. But Rick hadn't lied. He pushed Joff on as the others came out around him, all padding their bare feet noiselessly in the dewy grass. Joff took a deep breath and furrowed his brow at the damp on the air like fog would roll in, or rain. But when he flicked up and around, it was clear and sunny as before. But it wasn't important, was it? No, it was nicer, that's all. In fact, it soothed the hot iron in his belly and let him take each step a little easier. With 5 paces between them and the girl, they stopped, hands clearly seen, but companied together so they wouldn't look to be jumping her. How they ever could, though, would be a wonder. They simply stared at her, her white shirts and bonnet seeming to glow in the evening light, the copper strands of her hair to put Rick's to shame, and her humming, low and hard to hear as it was sweeter than a mother's lullaby. Joff opened his mouth, figure clutched hard, and jumped back with a squeak as the girl, without a change in her seat or work, spoke casually, as though boys stumbling upon her were commonplace.
"Greetings, strangers."
Then she stopped her work and straightened, drying her hands on her apron as she turned.
"May I be of some help?"
When she faced them, Joff nearly whimpered, stomach flipping and twisting into knots as her eyes trailed over the boys' faces, Joff's last of all, giving him a little smile that lit up her face like sunset. She was young, no older than Rick, surely, but her face was the most beautiful Joff had ever seen. Her eyes were crystal blue like a frozen lake. Her sun-kissed skin was smooth and without mark or freckle, and her bodice was due for womanhood, despite her apparent age. Joff swallowed again and rushed his eyes up to the gentle curves of her face when he realized he was drinking in her body. Thankfully, she'd moved back to the older boys. He went red and thrust up the figure with one hand, staring wide-eyed at the womanly curves of her face as she lilted her cool gaze back onto him. Then she smiled. He thought that she'd smiled before, but this must have been her true smile, all teeth between her red lips as she giggled. And if that wasn't the most beautiful sound Joff had ever heard, he'd call himself a liar.
For me?
She asked in a high voice, red eyebrows raised with a head half bowed, as if not to spook him away. He nodded, and she leaned down on her milking stool to find his face.
Thank you, young sir. I shall treasure it always for your gentle kindness.
She sat back and admired it with her slender hands, smile no smaller, though she ruffled her nose amusedly, then clutched it to her chest with a sigh.
Though I have nothing to give you, I fear.
Is there nothing? Rick said coolly, and her eyes flicked to the older boy, smile unwavering, though different, as she looked him up and down. Then Rick came round to stand beside Joff, hand on his shoulder. Anything from such a beauty as yourself would suffice, I think, would it not, little Joff? He looked down, but the expression Rick wore was one Joff had never seen before. Regardless, he nodded, hands coming together at his lap.
Anything, you say?
She found Joff's eyes, and she was the sweet girl again.
Truly?
Joff nodded.
If you think it good to give, then I think it a good gift.
He swallowed, surprised he didn't stumble over his tongue. Then the girl tilted her head with a frowning smile and knelt on her apron to take Joff's face and place a gentle kiss on his lips. Joff froze, eyes wide and head red from scalp to shoulders. It was only a moment, so tiny a moment, but she'd kissed him. She'd kissed him, and not on the cheeks like his mother, but on the lips. He smiled, face still hot as she sat back on her heels, and flicked her eyes to her left at something in Rick's hand. She smiled like she had before, sweet and wide and glowing, but there was something beneath it all, something grown up and fiery.
Another gift?
She asked a little lower, looking over her shoulder before finding Rick again with her lip between her teeth. A beaded necklace, beauty, made from living oak and stained leaves from the forest and roses besides. He held up the simple lace of rosary and wood, the latter yellow, the rose almost black, and all of it smelling faintly sweet. She gently rose and lifted her slender fingers to the back of his hand, pulling it to her nose to breathe in the scent and hum softly, eyes shut with a different smile. She opened her eyes on Rick, and the ice seemed to burn as her fingers twined around the beads and pulled them over her head.
But I have nothing to give you either, handsome boy.
Rick smiled like a fox, hair still fallen around his face. My friend said it well. Any gift you think to give is one worth receiving, surely. She smirked and tilted her head, looking around sheepishly before she stepped close and took his face in her hands. She pulled him forward, and he followed her, hands in his pockets as she set her lips to Rick's, and let them sit a little longer than she did for Joff. Her fingers lilted to the ring of beads at her breast, with a small smile as her pale eyes held Rick's for a moment.
Where is everyone?
Lonnie asked like he'd just woken, and that made Joff blink and take a deep breath as if he'd been dozing himself. He looked across the open land, no larger than the Upper West Quarter mayhap, but there was no one. Or almost no one. He squinted at shapes moving before another barn in the distance, a few others about the queer circular homes.
"We women are ready in the even meal,"
she said in her strange accent that made Joff furrow his eyebrows as he still looked around.
"The men have been away for 2 days on a hunt to celebrate my cousin's turn of manhood."
She sounded almost sad, and Joff wanted to find her face, to take her hand and hold it like his father did his sister's. But there was something standing in a nearby doorway. Another girl.
"We miss them sorely. It can be so boring here without the boys."
"Well, we're here," Jackson said with a slur and small laugh. Joff kept his eyes around them as some of the figures moved to stand in their yards, puzzling around much like he did. "Indeed we are," Rick said haughtily, drawing Joff's eye. "It must get lonesome here in your village if you're resigned to milking in the evening." She looked back at the heifer with a raised eyebrow and giggled, patting her haunches as she faced them again with a woman's smirk, the beast worrying its brow.
"This is something of a punishment from my mother."
"A punishment?" Rick asked, stepping a little closer with a hand on his hip and mocking shock on his face. "Whatever could a beautiful maiden like you do to earn a punishment?"
"Methinks she must be jealous of you,"
Lonnie said in a thick accent. Joff stepped back a little, and the girl found him, her eyes suddenly sharp before they smoothed over like river rocks. He smiled, face flush, before he looked back at the others. They weren't so far back now, spreading out to almost Rick's side. But Dan, looking at the ground, held Jackson's arm tightly, keeping a little further back than the rest.
"Mayhap,"
the girl said.
"but it can't be helped. I'm done soon at any rate. But you're welcome to stay for even meal if you wish it."
Her words echoed in Joff's head and sent his mind reeling. He swallowed and shook, blinking hard as he looked out on the rest of the land. The figures were closer and facing them now.
"Rick,"
Joff said, and it drew everyone's eye. He looked up, but Rick's face was as carefree as when he sunned on a rock after a long swim. So Joff flicked to the others. Lonnie looked drunk, Jackson dazed, and Dan found him with wide, burning eyes that matched what Joff felt. "What is it, Joff?" Rick asked. "Are you enjoying yourself? She's a wonderful host, is she not?" She giggled and stepped forward, taking Rick's cheek in hand and pulling it until he looked into her eyes. She smiled wide, the sweet smile that made the air glimmer.
"My name's Cersei, after my mother, and her mother before her."
Rick grinned, his hand coming to hers and stroking her skin as he watched her with heavy eyes. He tried her name and giggled like he were drunk. "A beautiful name for a beautiful girl. Mine's Rick. I'd love to stay for even meals so long as it's at your table."
I'm Lonnie,"
Lonnie fumbled, and she smiled as she pressed her bosom against Rick's chest, her other hand finding his shoulder as she stood on tiptoe to reach his lips again and kissed him. Lonnie and Jackson cooed and sighed as they watched, shoulders slouched. But Dan was staring down at her feet, face white and breath heaving. Joff swallowed and followed his gaze. Hooves. She had the legs of a doe, from bare cloven hooves right into her skirts. Joff swallowed again and looked around the land, the wind churning the trees and rustling the smoke, carrying something else, almost like words.
"Lonnie, you say?"
another girl asked, and Joff jumped out of his skin, reeling back a foot to find a girl smoothly walking in the shadow of the queer barn. She was shorter than the first girl, Cersei, with only a simple dress to hide her doe legs, but her bonnet was gone, and her fiery hair tumbled past her buttock in loose waves. Joff found her piercing silver eyes and flicked away, freezing on the small pair of velvet buds in the sweeps of her widow's peak. Joff found Dan's face as the girl approached, hands behind her back and smiling like she should gobble them up. The older boy looked green, eyes locked on the ground as Cersei finally pulled away from Rick and slid her bonnet from her braided copper hair. It caught the sun and looked molten. Lonnie spun around to meet the new girl.
Yes, I'm Lonnie. I'm the funny one of the group. All the boys say so, don't you, boys?
No one answered, and he didn't wait for them to, only watched as the new girl came into the sun and bit her lip, back bent shyly as she came up to him. Lonnie swallowed.
You are the funny one, I can see it. I think you'll make me laugh.
She wrinkled her little nose and pinched his chin, wiggling it enough to make Lonnie laugh as she leaned into him, faces close. The laughing stopped when she forced her lips on him.
I'm Jackson,
he said, failing to pull out of Dan's grip. In fact, Dan had pulled them back slightly, further than where Joff stood.
Jackson.
Another girl's voice came as she rounded the corner of the barn. She was in a house dress, the sleeves short and the fabric thin enough to pick up in the mounting wind. The wind whispering strange words. She grabbed her skirts and lifted them near the knee to walk closer, revealing her dozed legs and a smile even more beautiful than Cersei's.
Jackson,
the girl said again as she came round Cersei's side, but her tan hands took Rick's jaw and pulled them after her face. Her smile widened, and she looked back to Cersei.
Oh yes, this one will do nicely. We need new stock.
Dan gasped sharply as he looked up, feet skidding back with Jackson fighting him the whole way, reaching like a screaming babe after the new girl, and another, and another. Joff backed up, skin crawling as girls, 8 of them, walked from the shadows of the barn, the nearby house, the curve of the hill, behind an old tree to the west, everywhere. They were no older than Rick, hair like fire, eyes like ice, smiles like beauty itself, with doe legs and budding velvet antlers in the arches of their hairlines.
Such cute boys,
one said as the girl at her shoulder agreed.
It's been some time since men have wandered here unbidden. The last boy we saw was a gift from the Cunninghams to the king, but he's not a real boy, all that gold.
She chuckled, and all the girls took up a laugh, like a choir of bells and birds, lilting beside the breathy voices on the wind. Joff looked up at Rick, trying to call for him as he backed closer to the woods, but there was something different. His bare arms were hairy as a man's, his legs too, and the bend of his limbs, the muscle of his back, the shape of his neck. He was wrong. Rick went to look back at Joff, and before Cersei pulled his gaze back to her, Joff saw it. The long snout, the fat, wet nose, the buds on his forehead.
Tell me again,
Cersei said, pressing her body into him.
Tell me you want to stay.
I'll stay for supper if it's at your table, Cersei. But his voice was deeper, slurred.
Me too,
Lonnie said, as the girl pulled off him, his face no better than Rick's, nor the rest of him.
I want to...
Dan clapped his hand on Jackson's mouth with wide red eyes and tears streaming down his cheeks. The girls, all 8 of them, turned their pale eyes on him and stared, all with the ice of winter's past. Dan and Joff gulped, took a breath, and Dan swung, dragging his larger, muscled brother as he bolted the few paces back to the woods. Joff, screaming, bolted after them. The wind rose and rose and rose. The voices grew until the whistle of the wind was swallowed in them, and calling, for Joff and Dan, for all of them. It screamed and begged like a mother pleading for her babe's life, like a lover pleading for a partner to stay when he must go, and did not stop as Joff burst past the trees. He turned and found Dan throwing Jackson into the forest as one of the girls crouched and leapt like a cat, landing beside him and snatching his arm. Dan screamed like he'd been thrust into flame, sinking to his knees as he tried and failed to make words, just clawed at the soil. "Go!" he screamed to Jackson, sprawled on the ground, blinking the haze away and staring at his brother. Joff looked up and found Rick and Lonnie knelt on the ground, their shirts tight and tearing as 6 of the girls fell beside them and petted their skin, kissing their cheeks and shoulders and scratching their nails down their backs. Tails sprouted over their short pants, their feet went long and split into huge cloven hooves. Their bodies went covered in hair as they groaned and moaned, writhing until they were on all fours. Then Rick reared up, bones shifting under the skin, and let out a cry as his clothes tore off him and his naked body twisted and grew. Joff's ears rang as he stared through teary eyes at the young bullock, fighting to stand where Rick had knelt not moments ago, then at the black bullock where Lonnie had knelt. "Run!" Dan screamed in a half-human voice as Jackson stood, crying and bolting for Joff, picking him up and diving into the shadow of the northwood as one of the girls stalked past a tree. The last Joff saw from over Jackson's shoulder was Rick and Lonnie turning their heads round in confusion and kicking madly before the girls all giggled and settled them down. But Dan screamed and howled curses that ended in guttural snarls as he wrestled the girl into the grass, body twisted and covered in grey fur as his long snout snapped into something like a wolf and snapped at the woods girl. She screamed as Jackson ran harder than Joff had ever seen him run, and they both cried. They ran and ran past dark, using the moonlight as guide to find each of Rick's marks until they burst out at the wall. Jackson tripped as they fell into the grass, the elder panting on hand and knee and vomiting before the wind blew over them and whispered strange words. Joff shot up and pulled Jackson to his feet with a scream as the voice came hard in the wind, and he swore he saw eyes aglow from the unblinking forest. Somehow they climbed the rope and fell into the grass, crawling south, ever south, into the pasture before Jackson gasped and balled up his fists. He pounded the ground as Joff stared at the wall, heart beating his ribs as his lips went numb and he brushed his mouth. He licked his lips and spat the venom of the woods girl away, stumbling up to his knees and slipping as he made to stand. He landed on his side and found Jackson snarling at the ground, the grass gone and his fingers covered in dirt and blood. But tears fell from his eyes with hoarse whimpers. Joff swallowed and tentatively set his hand on Jackson's shoulder. Then it was a blur. Jackson lunged and took Joff to the ground, bloody fist raised as he screamed. They stared at one another, and Joff saw Rick, Lonnie, and Dan's faces, the ones he knew, and the ones that they'd become. His eyes went wet, his face twisted under Jackson's snarl.
If it wasn't for me,"
he gasped as Jackson's eyes went wide like he'd just woken up. His fist lowered as Joff sobbed under him and Jackson scooped him up in an odd hug. Their legs were tangled, their arms were at strange angles. Joff could barely breathe in Jackson's chest, and the other's face silently snarled in the crook of Joff's shoulder. Jackson squeezed him tight and whispered something Joff couldn't hear, but his voice was kind, kinder than he thought he deserved, and they both cried. They cried until their chests ached, until their heads hurt and the tears were gone. Then they sat back and stared at the wall, Joff's mind empty, his hand in Jackson's as something howled on the night air. A wolf. It drove up the cattle into a fit of calls behind them, but some called from deep in the wood too. 2 mournful bays, deep as lonesome bulls, and the howl, long and angry and hopeful.
8 maids a milking, 7 swans a swimming, 6
geese a-laying.